wonderful setting, the National Farmers Market, also Yazoo Brewery, and Corsair Distillery providing our drinks tonight. And our biggest sponsor for the evening is the Scott C. Chambers Fund. And Scott Chambers is a wonderful supporter of the Civic Design Center and has made funding available so that we can offer very high quality programming throughout the year. So thank you, Scott. And these special series, because we don't have an architecture program in Nashville, sometimes we don't, we need to be able to bring in great speakers, and that makes it possible. And also, the branding for it is called Audible, which is Architecture Urban Design Lecture Series, and we're doing several different events throughout the course of the year. And this was done in memory and in tribute to Stephen McBride, who is a wonderful friend and ally of the National Civic Design Center, who is no longer with us, but we're trying to continue to carry on his amazing spirit in everything we do. So again, thank you, Scott, for supporting that. Our program tonight is on the Rural Studio, and I had the wonderful experience of being able to go to see the Rural Studio firsthand when I was an architecture student at UT Knoxville, and it was so impressive as a young designer. And I'm just thrilled that we can offer this program. And as a part of that, in addition to this event, we are also doing an urban design field trip tour. So we're going to take a busload of people down to Alabama and get a chance to see the Rural Studio firsthand. And there's information about that on the assignment table. So if you have a chance to look that over and you're interested in doing the field trip, we would welcome you to come on that. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Preston Smith, who's the Associate Director of the Rural Studio, and I'll let him kick it off.
Fantastic, thanks Gary. It's really nice to be here. It's great to hear that you guys are doing an urban design field trip to the Rural Studio, because it sounds like a funny thing, but it actually means that you get it. That even though we are the Rural Studio, that is actually, in a lot of ways, an urban project, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk something about that tonight. Thank you everybody for coming. It's the other kind of nice thing about doing this like this, and this great venue, is usually I'm sort of slotted in between you and cocktails, so it's nice to actually have you happen on the front end. Because I think, Gary, you're right, you've got about 2.5 hours to do this presentation, is that right? So 3 or 4, is that right? No, what I'd like to do is, probably talk about an hour and try to give you kind of some insight about the program. The other thing that's really fun to come to a place like this, like Nashville, is we've got so many of our alumni, some of my former colleagues. I did my undergraduate work at Auburn, and also a lot of former students. It's really great to see you all here, so thanks. Hopefully maybe even the folks that know a lot about the Rural Studio learn a little bit more today as well. So hopefully most of you know some about the Rural Studio. But typically when we get out and are able to give these presentations, what we'll find is folks know the Rural Studio through one particular lens. And so hopefully what I can do is kind of talk a little bit about it more broadly and some of the things we do. Maybe one of the easiest ways to talk about what the Rural Studio is to actually maybe first talk about what it's not. So first and foremost, we're not an architecture firm. We're also not a construction firm. We're not an architecture school. We're none of those things. Those are the kind of things that a lot of folks think we've got going on. What the Rural Studio really is it's a piece. It's a really important piece of a 5-year undergraduate program, accredited program in architecture at Auburn University. So the Rural Studio is really a remote venue in which we have a number of students. Some of them are in their 3rd year and some of them are in their 5th year. They go out and spend either one semester or even a full year or more working on designing and building projects in rural West Alabama. So in a way, if you've gone to, if any of you have gone to an architecture school before, any kind of school, where the Rural Studio fits in our curriculum is really, in a funny way, in the place where in other schools their sort of study abroad experience might be, in which the goal of a program like that, a field studies program, is for young people to actually get out into the world in a place that's unfamiliar to them and kind of immerse themselves in a community and a culture so that they may learn more about the world around them. So the Rural Studio really is a sort of a deep, immersive program. It is a design-build program. It was founded 22 years ago by Samuel Mockbee and E.K. Ruth around just a couple of really simple premises. The first is that good design is for everybody, whether they can afford it or not. Sambo, he coined a phrase that he called the citizen architect. He said the goal of Auburn's program was to educate citizen architects. And that was a really important thing for him to kind of put those particular two words together and to actually put citizen first. He really sort of understood how important it was to be citizens in the place that we find ourselves. And as an architect, he believed that, if we're going to elevate the sort of profession of architecture to be a true profession, that we had really serious, not just ethical responsibilities that we all are familiar with, but actually professional responsibilities. And he would often compare to be a professional architect to be like a doctor or a lawyer. And he said, if a doctor is driving down the road and they see an accident on the side of the road, a doctor not only has an ethical responsibility, they have a professional responsibility to act when they see crisis. They don't stop and see if somebody has an insurance card and see if they can afford help. But they will actually lose their license if they don't act when they see crisis. And he said, architecture, if it's going to be a real profession, architecture ought to have that same kind of professional responsibility as well. And I think we try to instill that in the folks that we work with. So the second kind of thing that Sam really conveyed so far is that one of the best ways to learn how to do things is to actually do them, right? And so the Rural Studio is really a practice-based organization. It was built around working with real clients, with real projects, with real budgets, with sort of real schedules, and to really try to make a difference. And so the last bit of the Rural Studios is that, architecture is really uncomfortable. That whatever, I'm sure there's a lot of architects and designers here, that whenever you take on a design project, you never get, you're always kind of uncomfortable, wondering, can I do this? This seems impossible. Do I know how to accomplish this thing? It's really, really difficult thing in front of me. And so, we all know, if we've been doing it for a while, that you never really get comfortable with it. You just get more comfortable being uncomfortable, I guess. And so the way that you get comfortable being uncomfortable, trying to do impossible things, is that you do it together. And so the studio-based model of the Rural Studio is also really, really, really important. You can't learn to swim in a field. Ancient Chinese proverb. It's the provenance of this is a little suspect because it actually came out of fortune cookie in a Chinese restaurant in Auburn, which some of you are familiar with. And but it still actually is a pretty good thing, right? Is that if you think about it, right? If you want to learn how to swim, you need to go to the water. You need to go to the creek, right? It's pretty obvious. But I'd say the Rural Studio is actually about something a little bit different than that, because there's another way that you can read this that I think is more important and really more profound. And you can think of it this way, is that if you actually find yourself in a field, what in the world are you doing learning about swimming? You ought to be thinking about what you can do in the field right there where you find yourself. And so, one of the other sort of values that we instill in our students is that, place matters. The place that you find your feet really, really matter. The grass is not greener And then if you just look around you in your own community, there's plenty of work to do right there. A lifetime of work, multiple lifetimes of work. So this is our field, Hale County, West Alabama. It's agrarian, rural sort of place. It is sort of remarkably flat in a lot of places, but that's kind of part of the story. This is Alabama, we're in Tennessee. Auburn University is located on the east side of the state. The biggest city the largest city in Alabama is, of course, Birmingham. Hale County is over 2.5 hours west of Auburn, almost in Mississippi, practically Mississippi. It probably has actually more in common with Mississippi than it does sort of over on the east side of the state. Montgomery is sort of located in the middle, and that becomes really important, particularly when you begin to think about where Selma, Alabama is, which most of us sort of know something about Selma. And this sort of, we know this place really specifically, nationally, internationally, because it was the kind of center of the civil rights, what we now sort of think of as the civil rights movement. And this is kind of a really sort of critical part of the story, because many foot soldiers from the civil rights movement era came from Hale County, Perry County, Bernalillo County, the counties that we operated in. Coretta Scott King was born and raised right where we came from. The foot soldiers in the marches were our citizens in the place that we find ourselves. And Samuel Motley, of course, he grew up in this part of the world during this time. So it's incredibly sort of deeply resonant place in the historical program. It's a place of great wealth. You know, sort of we often talk about the poverty of the place, but it is a place of great wealth. But it is also a place of absolute abject poverty. I remember a couple of years ago, I was talking about this here in the lecture, and I shared this image of Shepherd Bryant's house here in Alberta. I asked students where they thought that it was, and they told me it was Haiti. It's really difficult to imagine that here in our country, which is purportedly relatively rich and relatively powerful, and we can do anything, we actually still have people living right next door to us, right around the corner, that live in these kinds of conditions. Now the truth is that they actually don't live in these kinds of conditions so much anymore. They actually live in these kinds of conditions. There's not a whole lot of tar paper shacks left in Alabama in the 2 decades that I've been sort of dealing with the program and doing this work. Those tar paper shacks are gone, but they've been replaced with kind of the second and third hand trailer home. And it doesn't look like much, but it is a fierce competitor for what we do. In a lot of the housing work that we'll talk about at the end, this is what we're up against. And when we come back and talk about it, remember that, because it's tough. It's tough to beat. So the Rural Studio, as I said, is part of Auburn University, and it's not separate and distinct from the university. It's a remote campus in Newbern, Alabama, and Newbern, as you can see, this is downtown. It's a sort of urban project. You can see it's a thriving metropolis. It's got a population of about 265 people, except with the studios and schools in session, and it moves up to a little over 300 people now in Newbern. So this is downtown. We're really fortunate in that it is a small town, but we actually have a number of things that are really important. We still have a store, a general store, Mercantile, and one of most of these small towns, as they're going away, one of the first things they lose is the store. And when you begin to lose a place to buy food, when you don't have transportation, it's the number one reason that people have to relocate to be closer to the place to sort of provide food for themselves. We also have next door to it here, we actually have a federal building. We actually still have a post office, which is also a really sort of remarkable thing to have. To actually have a place to pick up and receive mail and cash checks and those sorts of things. As you probably read, a lot of post offices are closing down, reducing hours and things like that. One of the great things about this being part of our campus is we've been known to haul university mailings out to the post office out here in Hale, so the federal government is sort of looking at, for post office to close down, they're sort of, I'm sure they're wondering, like, why are so many people in Newburgh mailing so much stuff? But it's great. It's really, really nice to kind of help keep it open. It's a really, really important institution. We sort of refer to the store as the kind of student union, it being a campus and all. Its proprietor of the store, GB, is our across the street neighbor buying breakfast, some orange juice right there. Frances Sullivan, who's our postmistress, people ask us all the time where, she's a really, really key component of our program. People ask us all the time, where do you find your clients? Right? And we hear about them from all over, but the number one place we get clients are from the folks that deliver things. So letter carriers, mail carriers, package delivery people, things like that. They're the ones who actually get up in people's homes and actually can sort of look in the door and meet them and know them and see how they're living. So Frances is a really, really important part of our team. We have an architecture building, we call it the Red Barn, which may be kind of obvious why it's named that way. It's very similar to if you went to architecture school. It looks like any other architecture school. We've got the third-year students sort of working on the ground floor. We've got fifth-year students working on the first floor. And it works pretty much like architecture school that you may have been in yourself. We have a faculty club, Spencer House, where our young faculty live and work. And then the worldwide headquarters of the Little Studios at the Morissette House. And maybe I can talk a little bit about that as well. Being a campus, of course, the students live there. It's immersion. It's an immersion program, right? So we actually have dormitories. We have a big roof with little buildings that we call pods tucked underneath. The big roof idea, it's sort of a southern vernacular thing. It's certainly a Little Studio thing. We've sort of figured out over the years if you build a big enough roof, you can sort of build anything you want to underneath it and have a pretty good shot of it being okay. So the place where the students live, the Little Studio in the early years especially was known for doing a lot with very little, with cast-offs, with three things, and so especially in those early years, we did a lot of material experimentation. We never experimented, on our clients. We always experimented on ourselves. So especially again in those early years, the students really, as they were sort of designing and building the environment in which they lived, were able to sort of stretch their wings and think about a lot of types of building assemblies. They are, of course, just incredibly studious and neat and tidy, and as you can see, as any college student might be. This is what a typical class looks like, right? They're just normal kids in an architecture school, just like anywhere else. This is a third-year class. They're typically, the third-year group is typically 12 to 15 students in a semester. The fifth-year students typically work in teams of 4. So there is really different, but I can talk really quickly about how a third-year project works, and I'll go through this fast. At the beginning of every semester, we do what is, for better or worse, we call neck count. And when Sambo started calling it that, it really meant that you sort of, work with everything from your shoulders down, right? So it's this really sort of visceral and embodied work, and you sort of thought with your body, not with your head. And so a lot of times we do renovation work, fix-up work, the students will help teams that are already working on their projects. But very often we get a lot of donations of things. A lot of times we'll get a donation of a building. In this case, we got a barn donated to it. So the group of students that came out this year, actually the very first task was to take down this barn, catalog it, sort the materials, and begin to think about what they might do with that. And that's kind of an interesting thing if you think about it. If it's not just a knockdown project, but if you think about we're going to take apart a building in order to understand how it's put together, it's kind of a nice thing. This particular group of students had a client named Rosalie Turner, and they were tasked with Rosalie. She was currently living in a home that was all falling down around her. And she had 2 adult sons who were sort of itinerant. They were kind of living with her, but kind of not. They were sleeping on friends' sofas and things like that. So one of the primary goals in this project was to get a home for Rose Lee that could actually bring her family back together. So the teams, again, and one of the funny things about the World Studio is a little bit different from a normal architecture school is that primarily we work through formal presentations. So the students are faced with just a whirlwind of professionals and consultants and teachers that come in on a weekly and sometimes even daily basis who are giving them a tremendous amount of feedback on their design proposals. And the students basically work from presentation to presentation. There's not, if you are from a more traditional design school for education, you're probably used to sort of working individually at your desk and coming by and getting a print from your professor and then sort of trying to move your project forward. The projects are done in teams, broken into smaller teams, faced with particular issues, and they're just always getting ready for the next presentation. In this group for Rose Lee, they came up pretty quickly with a scheme for what they call a courtyard house, which would basically give a machine for living for Rose Lee and her sons to move into. So think about what would be, what would they most need that would let them move in, and then they could actually build a wing for her sons to kind of expand into, creating a courtyard for the family. That became really critical because in this project, it was being spread over a group of students over multiple semesters. So by breaking the building down into two pieces, it solved sort of a programmatic problem, but it also solved sort of the issue of how do you stretch a project from one group of students to another. We worked through a lot of models, a lot of drawings, a lot of prototypes, and those sorts of things, and then we sort of get to work. We also make a lot of sort of detailed construction drawings. But then, the work begins, and it's sort of all hands on deck. In this case, this was Rose Lee's house here. The idea was to build a platform in front of the house, right in front of it, and then to build the first part, the machine part, in front, so they could sort of get out of the house as quickly as possible, and then push the existing house down and build the second part of the house. This is a house under construction. It's often, on these kinds of days, it's really great to have a lot of people on deck. Some of them are a little younger, a little more agile in those days when the projects were going on. But it really is sort of, a lot of energy that goes into the house. And this one, of course, so took down the building and some catalog of materials. Then on the interior of the house, you see a lot of those materials come back from the sort of building. The bricks, the wood, and the interior were all salvaged and repurposed for this project. This is Rose Lee and her two sons on move-in day. It was a great day. Beautiful front porch. One of the other things, besides just the big roof, that's really important to kind of a vernacular housing that you'll see a lot out of the Rural Studio projects, is you'll always see this sort of condition of the front porch. It is a really important social condition in our communities. The day after move-in day, immediately came and bulldozed Rose Lee's house, which is here, exposing the new house in front of it, and then built this wing behind it to sort of create that family courtyard. So really a kind of lovely project spread across about 30 different students working collaboratively on this project. The thing that we're probably most proud of on a project like this one is that very often when you have a group of students that are working together in this way, you'll very often wind up with a project that looks like 30 people designed it. There's a theme there that every student can point to and say, I did that. And so when you look at a project like this and actually imagine, young people who were, maybe 19 years old at the most, the fact that they had the maturity to sort of work together with sort of a single vision, a single idea to pull together such a cohesive project over such time, and over so many students, really remarkable. So this project is a real touchstone for us to sort of point to that idea that we actually use to show to other students sort of what they're capable of if they're willing to work really closely together. People know the houses that we do, of course. We started out doing houses, providing single houses for single families. Over the years, we've become much more capable and much more invested in actually doing community projects. One of the early projects, I'm going to show you a bunch of them and try to go through them pretty quickly. But one of the first kind of early community projects was Antioch Baptist Church. Antioch Baptist Church was existing in this building, and it kind of actually looks good in this photograph, but it's actually been washed off of its foundations and it's in a flood. It's sitting on the ground. It was uninhabitable. And so the congregation actually would meet, sort of out. This is a view for the students, but the congregation, when they were able to get together, would actually meet outside. So that they asked us if we could help provide a building for them. In that case, we actually took down that building the same way that you saw the images before, and used a lot of the materials to sort of build a new church. The foundations of the existing church, the steps of the existing church are there, but then the new church is back behind you. And what you'll see the students did in this project was to actually make a really sort of strong, internally focused, closed building from the outside. It actually is supposed to seem really, really sturdy in some way. But then when you come in, it begins to open up and turn itself to the outside. And here, when you come in, is where you actually begin to see all of the materials from the original church being repurposed, and then sort of view through the church back to the family cemetery beyond the church. So the idea is that you sort of come in and kind of see to beyond where you can go next. So we do sacred projects like that. We also do kind of profane projects as well. This is a series of toilets that the students designed and built at Perry Lakes Park. It was a really fun project because it was one that the grown-ups got the most excited about, and the students, when they first began to take on the project, I think they were a little disappointed to some degree that their classmates were working on these sort of big, sort of grand things, and they were being asked to design restrooms. They got it really quickly, and they wound up designing and building some of the most beautiful restrooms that you've ever seen. They're actually up for a competition right now, right? So they need a lot of votes, right, to win. Is that right? So the idea of this was that Perry Lakes Park was to use a series of toilets. It was a park that we had worked to reopen. It had been closed for about 40 years. More and more people were coming to the park, and the idea was to obviously the restrooms, but we also needed kind of an entryway and gateway. So how could you begin to use the infrastructure of restrooms to do that? So the idea the students had was really simple. It's like, let's use the restrooms. You can drive forever to get there. The first thing you do is get out of the car and go to the bathroom. So let's use the restrooms to actually be in some way not just word signs, but sort of physical signs to actually engage you in the first year of the park, to actually get to expose you to the sort of different conditions that exist in the park. So the first one, the mound toilet, is that when you go in and you come through the door and you sort of sit down to do your business, you have this sort of beautiful, kind of powerful view to the landscape, this sort of horizontal view to an open part of the park. And the tower toilet, 40 feet tall, when you come in and sit down, the only place to look is up. And then you have this sort of relationship to the sky, right? So there's this first toilet, you have this relationship to the ground. The next one, you have a relationship to the sky. And the third one is really fun. You've sort of always heard that story, you can't see the forest for the trees. Well, this toilet, when you're sitting down, you have this sort of very special relationship with sort of one tree. So you have forest and trees. The world famous Hale County Lakes Bridge. This project, there's a lot you can say about it, but one of the things that I think is really, that I always think is really important to say about it is, because you wouldn't know from looking at the project, but this was a real turning point for the Rural Studio as well. Another one of those touchstone projects where I guess it's probably the most important thing to say about it is that it's where we started really beginning to understand how we might begin to use technology, very, very powerful technology to actually assist in designing these projects. So there's a tremendous amount of computational horsepower that went into the design and engineering of this bridge. And I think what in that regard, the thing that we really find so important about it is it's not evident. And so this project was coming along at a time when architecture schools were really beginning to embrace technology, and you could really see it in projects, right? And in this one, it sort of took on the technology that needed to design this 130-foot clear cantilever bridge across a creek, but did it in a way that wasn't really showing off. It wasn't about the technology. The building is still solely about its sort of performance. And that's a kind of a really another mature kind of thing to do. What this project did, also really important to Perry Lakes, was that it actually opened up a larger part of the park to visitors. And the park was really, that became important because it's one of the major flyways, migratory flyways in the United States. We have two, one of which goes right over Alabama. As birds migrate north and south, this is one of the stopping points along that migration. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because, if you begin to look at actually hobbyists and what kind of hobbies generate the most per capita income, bird watching is amongst the highest. And in a place that doesn't have a lot of dollars, generating tourism is really, really a high priority. So what this allowed us to do is sort of open up this kind of big bird sanctuary that was on the 7 Oxbow lakes right across the bridge. And so the next group of students that came out, their task, their project that they went on with was to actually design a birding tower. The first thing they did was design and build a bridge through the park. What was really kind of the lovely thing about the bridge is that very often when architects talk about touching the ground lightly, right? All of you sort of heard that what your building touches the ground lightly. And typically what that actually means when you touch the ground lightly, it means that you put a hole of concrete in the ground in a few places, right? Instead of a little bit of concrete all over. The bridge team kind of wrestled with that kind of conundrum because they couldn't get concrete or equipment across the creek, right? And so on one side of the bridge, there was a sort of very large kind of concrete foundation, and the other side of the bridge touches the ground really lightly. The next team that came in, they sort of learned from that bridge and actually took it a step further. When they built this boardwalk, they didn't put any concrete in the ground at all. We'll talk in a second about how they did that. But you can begin to see by doing that, by not having these sort of giant pillars and foundations and footings, you can see that the bridge just sort of winds very gracefully, almost floats along the kind of Oxbow lakes. So the birding tower folks, we always imagined when we got the project, being mature grown-ups, we always imagined that when the students were going to design a birding tower, that they'd probably be a little platform, a little ramp to kind of go up in the air and do a nice sort of thing to kind of look out over the lakes, and it'd be lovely. Just like you see a lot of birding platforms everywhere. And this group of students, they had this idea is that this is a rural studio project, and it needs to drive tourism, and the way that you drive tourism to come all the way to Perry Lakes it's got to be the best birding tower in the world. So, in working with the Auburn Society, they found that they said, what are most birding towers missing? And they said, well, typically when you have a birding tower or a birding launch platform, we kind of can only see one ecosystem. The birds typically live in there's different birds that live in multiple ecosystems and different stratifications, and sometimes there are birds that live there, spend their entire life within a 10-foot deep section of the forest and never go below it and never go above it. Well, it would be really fantastic if you have a tower that could expose you to sort of all the ecosystems and across the ecotones within your ecology there at Perry Lakes. So it's just great. It sounds super. That means we've got to have a 100-foot tall tower. The bridge was kind of a technological marvel and almost impossible to build. The burning tower was like taking that bridge and standing it on end. Not virtually impossible. And there was a review right coming up before Christmas, and we had some very mature, smart people that came out from campus, and they took us to task. And they said that we were as irresponsible as anyone had ever been in allowing the students to think that they could take on that project, that it could not be done. And they were right. So we met with the students, and we said, I know it's frustrating to hear that in review, but they're right. That, it's not possible. You're going to have to rethink. We're going to have to rethink this project. So they went away. It was right before the holidays. They went away for Christmas. They came back, not deterred. They said, "We got an idea. We got it. We figured it out." I said, "What?" And they said, "We have found a decommissioned fire tower that's 50 miles away that we can buy for $1." And we said, "That sounds interesting." And so, lo and behold, as you can see, that's what they did. They bought this fire tower from the federal government. They found a company to donate equipment and training to take the tower down. And so that's another project in which we're sort of taking the building down in order to learn how to put it back in place. One of the interesting things about it is they have the training and equipment. Usually we're able to sort of show the students how to do things and help them figure out. And in this project, here's Andrew Freer, my colleague. This is kind of what we had to do on this project. Is sort of stand and watch and have them show us and tell us how to do what they were doing. One of the cool things about a tower, as you take it down, let's say one of the scary things about a tower as you take it down is where you start. You start at the top, which is kind of the scariest, seemingly most difficult place to start. It'd be a lot more fun if you can start at the bottom and kind of figure it out. The upside of it, though, is that the pieces of the tower are a lot smaller at the top. They're a lot easier to handle. And what we actually found is that as we worked our way down, it actually got harder and harder and harder to take apart. In the process of taking it down, around this project, the students came in and said, "You know what we found." I said, "What did you find?" I said, "We found a tower that's 200 feet tall that we could buy for $10. And we're like, no. So if you ever wonder if the Rural Studio has any limits, there was a line somewhere between a 100-foot tower and a 200-foot tower. But be that as they may, they took it down. They cleaned it up, re-galvanized everything. So a real sort of important design component of this project was actually the location of the tower in place, exactly how it was in place. The reconfiguration of the stairs and platforms that actually gave particular views, particular levels inside the park. To go back to that, this was the team that first looked at boardwalk. This tower, this 100-foot tower, also doesn't have an ounce of concrete in the ground. What they've done here, now you can see how the bridge works, is they've taken these big helical anchors, they stay around. They come in 4-foot sections, and they sort of drill down into the ground. And then you add another section and keep drilling. And so these foundations in some place are about 25 feet in the ground. They go in at an angle. And so the actual contact pad of the tower has footings that are about 30 feet across on each corner. Students being students, they had to sort of obviously pick the tower up off the ground and kind of show off their muscularity a little bit. But it is really sort of remarkable to do a project like this with actually really simple. Amazing views. Even if you don't know anything about Brewery, it's worth coming down. If you come on the trip, it's worth getting out here and climbing to the top. At least once. Has anybody ever taken stuff apart? Like you go in and take your mom, mix it with car or your dad's watch or whatever. What always happens? You can't quite figure out how to put it all back together, right? So before you go out on this trip and climb up the tower, you ought to know this, just in the spirit of full disclosure. When they were finished, it was sort of a pile of stuff. playing in the corner. And we said, what is that? And we're like, I don't know where to go. But, you know, I actually, it is true. It was a true story. But I really say that is that, you know, to talk about the kind of consultants that we work with. The students, you know, we have just remarkable engineers, or consultants, engineers, environmental consultants, lighting consultants, acoustic consultants. The students have no idea. They just think that's how architecture school works. They think that's what happens everywhere. But the menagerie of consultants that come in day to day, and the group that we work with regularly for years and years and years, we just couldn't do the work without them. And so, you know, the kind of interdisciplinary nature of the work, the experience that the students get, is really sort of above the bar. Very often in schools, students will work with students who are within disciplines. Engineering students will work with architecture students, or building science students will work with architecture students. And that kind of experience it's a great experience and it's a tremendous experience. What our students are able to do is actually, they're students working with professionals. And that experience is really one of the things that of all of the kind of practice-based parts of the real studio, that are the most important relative to kind of leveraging their education. And of course, it allows us to do, for the students to sort of imagine projects like this, to propose them and to push them forward. Quickly, we do all kinds of community work. This was a building as a sort of burned out school in Mary, in Hale County. The students redesigned it, reappointed it to sort of an after-school resource center for teachers and students. Hale County Hospital in Greensboro, right in our backyard, they got a really nice federal grant to expand their hospital. And as part of the grant funding, they added on this wing back here, and they actually got enough money to design this really, really nice recreational courtyard that you can see, where you can tell how pleasant it is to go out in the West Alabama sun for nurses and doctors and patients to sort of recreate and rehabilitate, right? You can only imagine. So our students, with very little resources, but a lot of labor, designed and built this sort of beautiful, beautiful courtyard in the hospital. It's for students. All these projects I'm talking about, that's actually probably, I should point out and remind you sort of what I said earlier. Every single one of these projects are designed and built by 4 students, designed and built by 4 students, typically 21, 23 years old. That's important. The New Bern, fire is a big enemy where we live. You know, it's a place that doesn't have adequate police service, garbage service, it doesn't have fire service, and what have you. Fires are probably the number one thing that sort of puts our clients out of their home, particularly in the winter. New Bern got, and also like Greensboro got a grant from the hospital, they got a federal grant, $800,000 to procure a new fire truck. Huge, right, for a community to have a fire like this, to have a fire truck, new fire truck for their community. A couple of things that were important about the design of the fire station for that truck is that it had the building had to keep the fire truck from freezing in the winter. You know, because there is no hydrant service where we live. It's, you know, it's a pumper truck, right? So it has a tank truck with a pumper built into it. So they actually have to carry 1,500 gallons in the truck to the fire. If it freezes in the winter, it's not much good, right? So in order to execute the grant, they had to have a building. Well, that's where they got locked up, because in a building that was large enough to house the fire truck, if they were going to keep the fire truck from freezing in the winter, they couldn't afford the energy bills. And so it sort of stood in the way of them building this truck. It was just sort of tied up. So we learned that conundrum, and we said, well, maybe we can help put 2 students on the project. That's kind of an interesting part of the project. For me, the most sort of telling part of the project that's kind of interesting to share is to talk a little bit about how the projects get divvied up among students. Every project that's in the studio, we know what they're going to be at the beginning of the semester. And students come in, they work collectively on each project, kind of trying to unpack issues about what what might they really be taking on in each project. And they do that for about 3 or 4 weeks. They work through each project as a group, all sort of 12 students. And then Andrew goes away, leaves them for a weekend, and the students sort of duke it out. And when Andrew comes back on Monday, the students tell them which projects they're going to work on, how the team's going to be organized for next year. In the discussion about the fire station everybody's working on, one of the things that the students unearthed during that kind of discovery phase of the project, they said the number one way that a fire truck gets damaged in a volunteer fire program is by the volunteer drivers backing the truck up into the building. So they said, first thing we got to make sure we do is that we never have to back the truck up. And so what that means is we've got to have a pull-through bay. Right? So we've got to be able to drive it back to the property, pull the truck through the back door, and go out. Great, makes a lot of sense. So another little piece of the Rural Studio puzzle is, we're a state institution, right, on one hand, but we're also a 503 nonprofit, and we can't put any state funds into these projects. So the cool thing about it, so all of the projects are done with sort of donated material, donated funds, in-kind material, and what have you. The really cool thing about that is that sort of all of our overhead and maintenance is actually covered by state allowance, right? So 100% of the fund donated to the studio will go right to projects, right? There's not many nonprofits out there that can say that. So what we started this project with, of those sort of gift funds, so to speak, was $20,000 or $25,000, $20,000. And so the students said, okay, so you have to have a pull-through building. We said, okay, so you got to have concrete in the back, you got to have a concrete slab to get out to the road. You got to have a roll-up fire door in the back, you got to have a roll-up fire door in the front. Somebody go tell us how much that will cost. So they did. Came back about 45 minutes later with our Google, and we're really excited. They said it will cost us $27,328 for 2 doors and all the concrete we need. And we've got $20,000 for the project. So all of a sudden, it got real. The students, and of course we, really began to understand what we had taken on. One of the real magic things about the Rural Studio is that when the students know that, they don't give up. They get really entrepreneurial. This group of students raised over $125,000 in both cash and in-kind donations to sort of see this building through to reality. Students being students, they thought it was pretty clever to build a fire station out of wood. It's probably way too big of a building for 4 people to be building out of wood, but it's beautiful. It acted as the first building that was built in New Bern in 110 years, which is also kind of an important sort of fact. The town didn't have a place to meet at all, and the city, it's a city, but it didn't really have a town council. They had kind of a pseudo mayor. They didn't have a place to vote. Those sorts of things. So the part of the program for this building became to have this kind of overloft where the community could actually meet, become a meeting place. So it's not just a big shed for trucks, but it's also a place to meet. It's also a lantern for the town. You can see. So it becomes a sign, as you go down the street. It's also really important, at the beginning when I said that, to sort of recognize when you're coming to rural West Alabama, Hale County to New Bern, that it actually is sort of an urban condition. It doesn't mean it's not rural, but it's certainly urban. To the students begin to actually think about this as an urban condition, and pulling the building right up to the street became really important. And sort of imagining what, as the town, as a sense of optimism about that. It begins to think about what will the next building do, right? As it comes up and snugs up to the street like good buildings in good cities do. Interestingly enough, you're really not allowed to do that with a building like this, right? You've got to have enough room, code says you have to have enough room for the fire truck to pull straight out from the front of the building before it takes a turn, right? So the way that, which immediately pushes you back, at least in a small town like this, pushes you back into kind of a suburban condition, away from the street. So what the students did was, this is actually the functional front of the building, and the students then extended this big porch out onto snug it right up to the street. It's a really important community building. It's the volunteer fire departments live and die by bake sales and barbecues and those sorts of things. So it became an important place to that, an important place for the town to be. And then that became critical a few years down the road. I'll show you another project in a second. This project, the Hale County Animal Shelter, in some ways was a response to the fire station. A big wooden building. It was probably a little bit too big to build out of wood. The fire station took all kinds of heavy equipment to build, cranes and things like that. We had to get the time donated on and what have you. This group of students set out to, the program of this building is also very large. They set out to build buildings, and how can we build a large building out of small pieces of wood that individuals can hold. So they used the vanilla structural organizational system to put this building together, piece by piece. We use that same structural system at Boys and Girls Club in Akron. In this project, one of the nice things about this is this is a skate park in Greensboro, which you'll see if you come down on the trip. The really nice thing about this one is we talked about it's an immersion program. The students were on another project. They were young people and they were skaters. Anybody here skater? Skaters. No. I skated in Nashville. You were a skater. I'm not a rubber anymore, right? So they fell in with the sort of local skaters, and the kids were constantly getting chased off the street, right? Always getting in trouble skating on sidewalks, skating on the street, whatever they didn't have a place to skate. So this group of students, working with Melissa, sought out and actually got a grant from the Tony Hawk Foundation to build a skate park. Now the cool thing about this is that these students were already there working on a project. So this sort of entrepreneurial spirit actually extended beyond their own project. They invented a project that the community needed for another group of students to come work on. Really, really sort of powerful stuff. The students did all of the work. Originally, the Tony Hawk Foundation said, yeah, we'll give you $25,000. That's what they did all over the United States. They say, but then they say you have to have professionals build the project, basically, for you. And the community labor, takes trees and helps with the concrete work, that sort of thing. So you actually wind up really small bowls or pieces of concrete that you kind of skate on. This group of students, they pushed through, they kept convincing the Tony Hawk Foundation that they actually could do the work, and eventually they did all the work themselves. And they designed a really sort of remarkable park in the sense that really the first park in the region, this is in the entire southeast region that had both kind of urban skating kind of stuff that you see going on here with transitions and riding rails and what have you, and also kind of vertical skating where you can actually drop in. It's now you see these things together a lot, but at the time it was pretty unique. We still deal a lot with material that folks give us. In this case, the company gave us, they called us up and they said, hey, we've got these 55-gallon drums, they're galvanized steel, are you guys interested in them? And we said, I don't know, can you send us a picture? They sent us a picture, and they were beautiful. These were beautiful silver drums. We said, do you want them? We said, well, send us some. So they sent us a truckload. There's 300 in the truck. And so we unpacked them, and then we did what architecture students do. They sort of organized them. They stacked them up into walls and rooms and mazes and those sorts of things and kind of thought about it. But we weren't really sure, we kept shoving these things around for about a year, not quite sure what to do with them. In one of the parks in Greensboro, in Lions Park, we were asked if we could design a playground. And the project really wasn't getting any legs. The students that were working with a great team of students, but they were sort of, looking for playground equipment donations, and the project up to a point was about kind of shoving playground, trying to how to think about playground equipment might be organized in a creative way. It really wasn't going anywhere. And so Andrew said, one, we can't afford to buy all that playground equipment. It doesn't seem like anybody's going to donate it to us, and so we're going to have to figure out something else. It doesn't matter what you do, but you're going to use those barrels. And that was it, right? And that changed a lot over the course of the year about the way we think about things. It's about how constraints really, really, really matter. And it was the first project that many that we've taken on in the recent past, of which they're really about material, the single material, how you really sort of push and challenge a material to its extreme. So this group of students, they designed and built a really, really fantastic playground. It's both, sort of artful, sort of beautiful sculpture of the landscape, and it's also just a lot of fun. It's brought a tremendous amount of just kind of unscripted play to the park, which is nice. It's also kind of a nice musical instrument. Another project that we worked on, we talked about the area, how it's such a critical sort of piece of the puzzle relative to the civil rights movement in the country. There was an organization that had been operating out of Greensboro, really sort of, just out of good graces to operate what they called the Black History and Safe House Museum. They call it the Safe House Museum, is in this house, this dog trot house. Dr. King was safe house from the Klan 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And the museum that was here was really fascinating because it wasn't so much a museum that sort of tried to tell the whole civil rights story. It was a museum that actually tried to tell the story of the local foot soldiers that had sort of spent their youth towards the cause. So we were asked if we would come in and sort of rehabilitate the 2 shotgun houses. The group of 4 students did that. They created a connector, a glass connector between the 2 houses. And then they actually did an addition on the back of the house. It actually houses an art museum or an art gallery. An art gallery that showcase work from sort of outsider artists throughout the Southeast. And what's kind of fun about this is that this is actually sort of done in partnership between Auburn University and the University of Alabama, which as much as we like to bang heads about football, it's a really great partnership. The art program at the University of Alabama actually curates this gallery. So back to New Bern, I talked about it as an urban condition. Sort of thinking about the fire station, sort of thinking of down the road relative to what might come next. Actually begin to give some information about if another building happened in New Bern again, what it would be. There was another building. It turned out that the fire station was a little too successful. The town got a real mayor, they got a real town council, they started having meetings. They needed a place to vote. And so we came back 7 years later and we had a team of 4 students design and build a town hall, which you see here. Another building completely out of wood, but this one's beginning to think about itself in a civic way. It's not going to compete on a scale and scope with sort of the massiveness of the big shoulders of the fire station. But it's built sort of, completely and unadulteratedly out of cypress logs, from a single material inside and out. It being the primary civic building in the town, to have these kind of sort of really, really sort of deep roots. Completely transparent. The town council meets right up on the street in a big glass room. Really important. Consecrated as a place to vote in the town. And as you can sort of imagine, a place like this, voting rights, voting accessibility is really, really important. Being able to walk to a place to vote for the first time in your life is a really empowering thing. Maybe the last project we'll talk about. Let's see. This is Lions Park Scout Hut, and this is a good one also to talk about the consultants that we work with as well. This is a team of 4 people. We were approached another project in Lions Park that the Boy Scouts do a tremendous amount of work in the park. They do a lot of all their service work in the park, and they didn't have a place to be. They they were basically meeting in a fisheries building where one of their dads had access, and they could sort of meet at night there. And as they would travel around the state to sort of see how other Boy Scouts were meeting, they came back and they were a little sad, because all the other Boy Scouts had log cabins, and they were meeting in this kind of metal fisheries building, and so they really didn't feel like Boy Scouts. So because of all of the work, all of the service work that the Scouts do, we felt like this was a great kind of project to take on to help them get a new home and to somehow help them figure out how to get a log cabin. So the students went out to sort of survey scout huts kind of all over Alabama, a few in Georgia, a few in Mississippi. And what they found is that these log cabins that the Boy Scouts loved so much were really, by and large, metal buildings, but sort of split half logs and moved to the front. And so our students, we could probably do better than that. So in a funny way, we had actually just built a log cabin that we saw at the town hall, where we used the logs, sort of in impression, used the strength of the logs stacked up in a very traditional way. In this project, the students had a different idea, and they sort of recalled what they learned in their sort of structures classes and their materials and methods classes. And they said, one of them said, what they never knew before they became an architecture student was they always thought that buildings fell down. And so what they learned in their structures classes is that buildings actually don't fall down and blow up. And most of the architects and engineers in the room get that, right? Is that as wind moves across the building, the uplift of the building eventually sort of pull it apart until it collapses. If you're in a sort of a big storm, then the building actually will blow up. And so they had this idea that instead of using the strength of the logs to hold the building up, to sort of work in compression, they would build a series of vents that you see, these sort of structural vents, and then they would load with logs like saddlebags that would hold the building down. And so in a way, the Boy Scouts have a real log cabin where logs are like actually really working the way logs work, not split in half, not glued on, really working. You can actually see how the building performs. Yeah, we'll look here. Again, sort of being students, they've got to pick the building up off the ground and actually show off and show that it floats. But it's really, maybe kind of an important thing to. There's lots of things we can end on. I'm going to end soon in a minute because I want to take questions if you have them. But this sort of notion of what architecture is about. It is about a lot of things. Architecture went through a time when a lot of us were in school, in which it was sort of ranging around trying to find relevance. And it was always kind of looking for relevance outside of itself, through what the sort of older folks in the room sort of know as the isms. There was all these sort of theories about architecture that was going to make architecture be more relevant and more meaningful. And what's really fantastic today, I think many of you know this in your practice, and certainly the students are learning it in school, and they're able to actually execute it here at the Rural Studio, is that architecture doesn't have to look outside of itself to be relevant. Architecture can actually look inside of itself and go back to those roots that we sort of all learned about firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, firmness, commodity, and delight. Right? And I think this building probably exemplifies that and really exemplifies what the Rural Studio is about. It's firm, right? It makes sense out of the structural conditions. It's not going anywhere. It's a social contract with the community to be real and to be honest and to sort of look the way it looks because of the way it performs. The utility is exactly that. How does it perform? Building performance or how a building performs as being the thing that generates the form of the building. That the building doesn't have to be a conceit anymore to be beautiful. But when it's just designed around how it performs, and you let it look the way it looks, this is what you get. If you just kind of forget about what things look like and think about what they are like. And you forget about the names of things and actually think about what they do. If you think about verbs instead of nouns, this is the kind of building you get. Focusing purely on utility. And then, Venustas, or delight, or if, Venustas comes from Venus, meaning beauty, right? Beauty is really back to that social contract, right? That architecture is socially relevant. And that's what makes it beautiful. Not what it looks like, but it's that purpose that it plays, not just in a sort of structure, but actually now begins to structure the community and hold and bind the community together. And so the last thing is that that's really why this is an urban project. Because we always think of urban having to do with cities, right? And it does. Right? But it's a sort of an optimistic term about not just cities, but cities are a side effect of how we decided to live together. And that's what we're doing in this place, kind of day in and day out, is learning how to live together. And hopefully that's the thing that our students take on into the world with them when they wind up in great places like this. So thanks for having us, and I'd be happy to take questions if you want to stick around and have time. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. What happened to the fire truck not freezing? I skipped right over that part, didn't I? You're really good at school, aren't you? So what happened to the fire truck not freezing? Thank you. It was, let's see if we go back. It's going to be a really sort of familiar condition. So this wall of the building faces south, and maybe from the interior you'll actually see what happens. It's passively heated. So what happens is in the wintertime, the sun, as it moves through the sky, stays really low. It doesn't get up really high in the sky. In the summer, the sun gets really high, right? So the way the students designed this building was it has these very thin louvers behind this acrylic wall. And what those louvers do is that when the summer sun is really high, it shades the wall, and so the sun can't come into the building. When it's low, the sun can actually come between those louvers and heat up this big concrete floor. So using the concrete floor is kind of double duty, not just a place to park the trucks, but actually as a way to kind of absorb heat from the sun during the winter. Then that concrete radiates the sun back out at night and keeps the building warm, but for no money at all. So they never have to turn the heat on. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's nice. That's a great question. Thank you. So the question is, how does this program integrate into the larger program of architecture? It's a great question. It's also a really important one. It's part of the program. It's not separate and distinct, is the short answer. So just like students, the students don't go out there and just do this work. They actually, we have 5 faculty that are at the Rural Studio full-time. We've got 7 staff members that are there. We have teaching assistants that are there. Any given time, we have 45 students. They take a suite of classes there just like they would on campus. And actually, the classes that they teach there are some of the same classes they could take on campus. What's really the important part is that that part that the Rural Studio isn't separate and distinct. And that's one of the things that's kind of a little different about our program. When the Rural Studio started 22 years ago, there were 6 design build programs already in the United States. So what Sambo and DK sort of invented, it wasn't design build. There were also kind of countless service learning opportunities in the United States, and so they didn't invent that part either. What they did was they put those two together. And that was the kind of creative act. And often, as we're designers, we know creation isn't about inventing something new. It's actually connecting the dots in ways that people haven't already seen, things that are right there to be seen that nobody's seen yet. And that's what, for better or worse, that's what design build programs and service learning programs in architecture schools have come to be. They're bundled together. And I say that for better or worse because we sometimes wonder if we do too much of it. Why not just do design build projects so students can learn through that without the sort of service component, where there's so many other ways that you can do service that aren't about building. So thinking a lot about that is important. But most programs are built around design build and service learning programs. Most architecture schools have one. We were the 7th design build program to start. Now there's of the 134 different schools that offer programs in architecture at the graduate and undergraduate level. There's 87 design build programs. Those are typically kind of separate and distinct from what's going on. Students sort of go and do that, and at Auburn, it's much more synthetic and become increasingly so. This is what we do. This is this sort of architecture in the public interest is what Auburn University School of Architecture does. There's nothing magic about the little studio when students wind up out here. That suddenly allows these students to do this amazing work. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and so it's probably a dumb analogy, but if the architecture program was a stick, the rural studio would be the pointy end of that really cheapy stick. This is kind of what we're all doing at Auburn, lifting to allow the students to do this work. And we have other programs. If you go on the trip, you'll learn about an urban studio as well. We could be here giving a complete kind of presentation about that as well.
Rusty, one more question.
One more? Okay. Yes. How did we wind up in Hale County, not some other part of Alabama? That thinks that's funny, because we were just talking about that earlier. So there's we should go out and have drinks. I'll tell you the truth. There's the legend and the truth. What is that? That's that great line from the man who shot Liberty Balance, right? When the legend becomes fact, think the legend, right? Sambo, Mississippian, right? Came to Alabama to go to school, to go to college. Everybody knows that. Grew up in the 60s. He was in school in the 60s, right? So we all know kind of what was going on in that period. Sambo was invited to teach at Auburn, and so he was going back and forth between Mississippi and West Alabama, and Hale County is kind of right in the middle of those two. And so, part of the kind of moral story that we tell is that it was halfway between home, and so it was a way that he could get closer to home and those sorts of things. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because Sambo knew the place deeply. Now, I knew it because he wasn't such a good kid. He was kind of rotten. And he was sent away to military school, the Marion Military Institute in Marion, which is a place where I showed you a couple of these projects. And so while he was in college, kind of marching off the merits around the drill field, he was also kind of immersed in this sort of, what was going on in the community, is that sort of the community sort of fighting for their rights, the right to vote, the right for equality. He was immersed in that. And so when he decided to come back and teach at Auburn, and he was going back and forth between these two places, it was just really familiar to him. So it was a nice, safe landing place, but it was one that had deep resonance for him personally, and of course, nationally, for the changes that happened just in his lifetime. So thanks. Thank you again. I hope you do talk to Gary. I hope you guys can come down. It's the best way to get kind of the full and complete picture of what we have going on. We'd love to see you down in West Alabama. Thanks.
All right, Rusty was very generous to provide a copy of the Newburgh Times for everyone, so they're on the table over there. It's a great feature on the Girls Studio. And one final plug for the trip, please pick up a brochure. They're also on the table. It gives abbreviated itinerary for the entire weekend. And just finally, to finish a plug on the Design Center. One of the main ways that we support our work is through the support of our members. So if you're not a member, please pick up a brochure and consider joining the organization. And I just want to thank all of our board members and our staff, our wonderful staff, Ron Yearwood, Eric Sear, Joe, Abby, everyone. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. They make this stuff happen. And thanks again. There's more food. Please finish. We don't have to take a lot of leftovers. And thank you again.